few of you I know, and some of you I've met this week, and I'm looking forward to be able to share with you. For those who don't know me, I just thought I'd share just a little bit about myself in connection to Harvey Cedar's Bible Conference, because this place looms large over me and my story and my family, and it's great. I agree to have my mom and dad here this week with me, and they brought us to the island as kids. We vacationed always 2 weeks up the road, and every Sunday we would come here for the conference. And then when I was a junior in finished my junior year in high school, and then my senior year in high school, I worked on staff here. I was thinking the other day, I walked into the kitchen area. I looked in, it hasn't changed a whole lot from my time there. But I arrived on a Monday, the first summer I was working, and I was to go and look at the list of jobs. And my jobs was pots and pans. And the conference was packed that week. And every Monday night we had lasagna. And so I think I was there till midnight. Everyone was gone. I was cleaning pots and pans. And so that was my initiation into serving as on staff here. But I would also say it was during that time that the Lord called me into ministry. And so right around here, I remember the spot. And I remember laying in my bunk that night and just saying, Lord, until you close the door, I'll keep walking in that direction. And he hasn't closed the door. And here we are. And so I'm just really grateful for the role that this place has played in my life in that regard. And then we have 4 kids, my wife and I, and all 4 of them worked on staff here. 2 of them met their spouses here on staff. So we now have 9 grandkids, and one of our sons' name is Harvey. So our son Sam and his wife Sarah met here at Harvey Cedars, and so we are a free walking advertisement. So someone says, why did you name him Harvey? Where did that name come from? And so we share how he got named Harvey. And so I don't know if we can get a kickback on that at all, but you have free advertising out there, John. And I will say this, my son Sam first met his wife Sarah when they were in the children's program. So when you're going back to pick up your kids, just kind of scan the area. That may encourage you, that may discourage you, I don't know, but that's where our Sam and Sarah met, and we're really grateful for that. So this place looms large in our story, and I have a feeling, I have a sense it's going to continue to loom large as the next generation comes of age, and so looking forward to what God will do with that. I want to share with you today, tonight, tomorrow morning, tomorrow night, spend a little time in the book of Ecclesiastes, Old Testament. We're going to parachute into the middle of the book. So I'm going to walk us through the last part of chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 9 over the next 3 sessions. So if you want to turn your Bibles, I'm going to be in Ecclesiastes 6, verse 10, and take us through chapter 7, verse 14 this evening. I thought since we're kind of parachuting into the middle of this book, maybe it'd be good to just kind of give you a couple introductory thoughts about Ecclesiastes before we look at our passage this morning, because you're going to hear some things that would be presuming that we've already spent some time in the first 6 chapters. So the first thing is the word hevel. That is the Hebrew word that gets translated meaningless, meaningless, says the preacher. Everything is meaningless. And in fact, that's how the book begins, right? Meaningless, meaningless, or vanity, vanity, says the preacher. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And so the word is hevel. Hevel, hevel, says the preacher. Hevel, hevel, all is hevel. And I will use that word a little bit because one of the challenges is it's a very hard word to translate into English. And so depending on the translation you're using, they may say meaningless, it may say vanity, absurd, and just a mystery. And so I will often use the word hevel. In fact, some would say it's more accurate to say it's like a mist or a vapor or smoke. And so what he's saying with the word hevel is like grabbing hold of life is like trying to grab hold of smoke or vapor. You can't control it. I like what one guy said. He said, grabbing hold of life or hevel is like squeezing wet soap. When you squeeze wet soap, it just squirts right through your hand. And so you can't really control life is what the point of the word is. And yet our world catechizes us to think that we can. Burger King just came out with a new slogan. Instead of that guy with the big head who peers into your window, kind of creepy, right? That Burger King. He says, a new king is in town. And the rest of the slogan is, and it's you, right? And so that's what we like to think. Like we're in control. We are the master of our own fate. Bobby Jameson in his book on Ecclesiastes said, you're not the captain of the ship. And he said, I hate to tell you, you're not even on the ship. He said, you are like fish that are caught in the net that are being pulled along by life. And so when we say hevel, we're talking about the vanity, the sense of meaningless, the idea that I am not in control. Second thing, by way of introduction, is you'll hear me refer to the preacher, or the Hebrew word is the kohelet. And when you look at Ecclesiastes, there are two voices in the book of Ecclesiastes. At the beginning and at the end, in the introduction and at the conclusion, there's a narrator. And then the rest of Ecclesiastes is this preacher, is this kohelet who's giving you some observations and some teachings about life. Now, a lot of people think that Solomon is that preacher or that kohelet. Some question whether Solomon is the preacher or that kohelet. But I will tell you this, he's not named in there in the book, and so I will often refer to him as the preacher or kohelet, because this is the one that is telling us about life. In fact, it's interesting, the book Ecclesiastes, the word Ecclesiastes is what in the Greek is what we get the word ecclesia, which is church. And so the impression is that this preacher, this philosopher, this kohelet is addressing an assembly and is sharing with them some thoughts about life. And the last thing I want to say by way of introduction, and I experienced this when I was preaching this at my home church, some people find Ecclesiastes to be depressing. And I think it becomes depressing if, and there's a phrase that comes all the way through the book of Ecclesiastes, is life under the sun. In other words, it's talking about looking at life from the ground level. If your only vision of life is at ground level or life under the sun, it is depressing. Because you're born, you live, you die, and you don't take anything with you. But I think what Ecclesiastes is designed to do is to get us to look at life above the sun. And it ultimately leads us to Jesus. And therefore, I find this book not to be depressing, but I find it to be filled with wisdom and helpful information for me to live out my days in this life that God has given to us. So those are some of the introductory thoughts I'd like to lay out before you, because we're kind of parachuting in. We're actually stepping into a transitional point in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we're going to talk about some nitty-gritty stuff over the next 3 sessions. We're going to talk about life and death. In fact, tonight and tomorrow night, that's the topic of both of the passages we'll be in. And tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about how to live life when it just doesn't seem to add up. Like my life doesn't turn out the way I thought I was going to be, or I find myself experiencing something that I had no idea was going to be hitting me, and I'm having to deal with this in life. So how do I live when life doesn't always measure up the way I thought it would? All right? And so that's where we're going to go over the next several sessions. So we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10, all the way to chapter 7, verse 14. I will read that eventually, but I just kind of want to make an introduction into this passage. And the last few verses of Ecclesiastes 6, I think, offer us, and this is what I like about Ecclesiastes, it offers us a dose of reality. After considering all the hevel of life in the first 6 chapters of the book, the brevity of life, the enigma of life, the passing from generation to generation, Kohelet the preacher resigns himself to the fact that this is the way it is and we can't change it. We can't alter the course of this world. He says in Ecclesiastes 6, verse 10, the beginning of our passage, whatever has come to be has already been named. This is akin to saying that there's nothing new, what? Under the sun, right? And what I love about Ecclesiastes is I think it really speaks to the sovereignty, the authority of God. God has fixed our destiny. What happens in the present is what God has predetermined in the past. Whatever has come to be has already been named. And so this journey through Ecclesiastes, I think, has a way of putting us in our place. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It reminds us, now you might say, well, this is obvious, but I think we blur this line all the time. It reminds us that God is God and we are not. I think that's one of the most significant, most important distinctions to maintain through life. It's this creator-creature distinction. God is God and we are not. In fact, that's what Kohelet says next. He acknowledges this in chapter 6, verse 10. He says, it is known what man is. What is man? Psalm 103, verse 14, he reread, he knows how we are made. He remembers that we are what? Dust. After the fall of man, we hear the curse of God pronounced over man in Genesis 3:19. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Right. And so if there's one thing you're going to learn from our time in Ecclesiastes, is that this is a reality you cannot change. Whatever has come to be has already been named. That includes the sentence of death passed on to us from the curse of Adam and the sin of the human race. What happens in the present is what God has predetermined in the past. David gives testimony to this in Psalm 139. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. And so God is God, and we are not. We are dust. There was a documentary aired on CNN this past spring called Kara Swisher Wants to Live Forever. I don't know if any of you saw it or were aware of it. I think the title caught my attention when I saw it advertised. And it was a documentary that investigates the booming multi-billion-dollar longevity industry that is trying to extend the human lifespan. She was investigating the various anti-aging treatments to see if any of these things actually work or if this is some narcissistic pursuit of the ultra-wealthy. And so I looked into it. I began reading about this documentary, and I discovered that this is an obsession among the Silicon Valley billionaire elite. One of the leading faces in this movement is a man by the name of Brian Johnson. He was the founder of Braintree, which is the online banking system. At one point, he owned Venmo, which many of us use. And availing himself of what biotech advances have to offer him and his hope in what he can glean from AI, he's doing everything he can to extend life, and it's his aim to reverse the aging process. So I found an interview that he did with Time magazine 3 years ago, and he revealed his regimen, which included taking 111 pills a day. He wears a baseball cap that shoots red light into his scalp. I don't know why or what that does. He said that any act that accelerates aging, like eating a cookie or getting less than 8 hours of sleep, is an act of violence against his body. There's a lot of violence going on over there across the road all week long. It's a dangerous place. Don't go in there. Now, common wisdom tells us that healthy patterns to live by, they can contribute to life expectancy, but this is more than that. He is on a quest to not die. He believes that death is optional and that recent advancements will unlock the potential of defeating death. On his website, this is what he says. We are at war with death and its causes. We are building towards listen to this, we are building towards an infinite horizon. We are fighting for the freedom to exist as long as one chooses. Perhaps the most telling thought that underlies his quest for immortality is what he said in his interview with Time. He said, listen to this, he says, we are reframing what it means to be human. I would commend to Brian Johnson the book of Ecclesiastes. You can't reframe what it means to be human. Now, this is an extreme example of the futility of denying the inevitable we find at the end of verses 10 and 11. You can't dispute with God over the fragility of your human frame. You can't reframe what it means to be human. You can't dispute, the text says, with one stronger than you. You can't argue with God. He adds in verse 11, the more words, the more vanity. And what is the advantage to man? In other words, what do you gain out of it? What do you get out of it? In other words, when our mortality stares us in the face, who are we to argue with God? I mean, think of Job. Job wanted to go toe-to-toe with God, to argue over and state his case over his pending mortality. And he has this encounter with God, and God came to him and said, Job, who is it that darkens my counsel by words without knowledge? In other words, God's saying to Job, what do you know? He asked Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. And by the end of Job's encounter with God, we find Job repenting. He confessed that he spoke of things he didn't understand. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know, he said. Paul makes the same assertion in Romans 9. He says, but who indeed are you, a human being, to argue with God? Will one who is molded say to the one who molds it, why have you made me like this? And so this is the dose of realism we come to at this point in the book of Ecclesiastes. We are dust. We come and we go. Whatever has come to be has already been named. And so what do we do with that? It leaves the preacher, Kohelet, asking some good questions about life and how to live it. These questions, to some degree, I think remain a little unanswered, but the first question is this in verse 12. For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? In other words, how should I live in light of all this hevel? What is a good and wise way for me to live my short and brief life? And then he asks another question. For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? In other words, who can tell me what tomorrow holds for me? No one can. I don't know what tomorrow will be. I don't know if it'll be a good day. I don't know if it'll be a bad day. I don't know if it'll be my last day. I don't even know if I will have tomorrow. So what is a good and wise way for me to live in light of all this hevel? Now, before we try to answer these questions, I want to make a couple observations about our passage. What is the preacher's frame of mind when he's asking these questions? There's debate here. Some commentators think that Kohelet is disappointed when he takes in the few days of his life. In other words, he's somewhat depressed about what he's discovering about life. And so he gives advice in chapter 7, and it's nothing more than trying to make the best of it, maybe offering a silver lining in the midst of all the hevel, if you will. In other words, he's saying, let me tell you how to make some lemonade out of the lemons of life, and this is about as good as I got at the end of the day. Other commentators disagree and suggest that Kohelet is not a pessimist here. He wants to show us a way of wisdom in light of the hevel of life. And I'm inclined to take this view as well. And I would add, as we walk through Ecclesiastes 7, 1 to 14, we have the added blessing of looking at these proverbial statements through the lens of Jesus, which takes us above the sun. And I think there's real wisdom and real joy to be gained here in this passage. And then finally, as we step into Ecclesiastes 7, Kohelet takes what he observes in life and he offers us advice on how we're to live. And so what follows is a series of proverbs. And the question he asks at the end of chapter 6 is, "For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow?" And so through these proverbs, he's going to tell us what he thinks is good for us to do as we live this short life that God has given us. And the words you will see over and over again when we go to read the passage in a moment are better and good. And that's how the chapter begins. A good name is better than precious ointment. And so as we crest through this chapter, you'll constantly hear how one thing is better than another. So as I read this passage, let's be attentive to that. So let me start in chapter 6, verse 10. I'll go all the way to chapter 7, verse 14. And the bulk of this are these proverbs that we find in chapter 7. So listen to the word of the Lord as I read it. Chapter 6, verse 10. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it's known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Now here's the Proverbs. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so the man may not find out anything that will be after him. So as we transition this evening to what is, to how we should live, I'd like to group these proverbs into 3 sections, and we would do well, I think, to take the sound advice of this passage as we seek to faithfully live out our days for the glory of God. I think this is advice that leads to the path of wisdom. So the first one is this: it is better to die well. It is better to die well. Now, whenever you come across a series of proverbs, I don't know about you, but I often find it a challenge to group them, because sometimes it just seems like it's a bunch of different proverbs that aren't connected to one another. In the book of Proverbs, there are large sections where every proverb seems to be addressing a different topic, and they're not really meant to be grouped together. So you might get that sense in this passage as well. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 1. What does the first statement have to do with the second statement? Look at it. He says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. Okay, I get it. It's better to be a beautiful person than to smell beautiful, right? Unless you're sitting really close to the person, then, maybe not. But yeah, he's saying he says a good name is better than precious ointment. But what does that have to do with the next statement? And the day of death is better than the day of birth. Is there any connection between these two statements? It seems to me that these two statements do go together, and I think a comparison is being made between the two. The opening statement is obvious, while the second statement goes against common logic. I think Kohelet is telling us where we can find good in this vain life, and he's telling us that just like it's better to be a person of good character than to smell good, so also it is even better for you to ponder the day of your death than to celebrate your birthday. One is obvious. The other gets your attention and goes against what's natural for us to consider. And yet both statements are equally true in defining for us what is qualitatively better for us to ponder. Look at the string of proverbs you find in the first 4 verses. The day of death is better than the day of birth, verse 1. Verse 2, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go house of feasting. In other words, it's better to go to the funeral than to a birthday party. Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter. Along the same line, verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of the fool is in the house of mirth. He's basically saying here that there's wisdom to be gained for living this vain life by reflecting on the brevity of life and the reality that your days are numbered. There's wisdom in that. Now, when I do a funeral, I always start a funeral the same way. I tell people why we are here. I say we're here to do 3 things. Number 1, we're here to remember. And we're here to remember the person who has passed. And that's a good thing to do. And to give thanks to God for the memory of that person and the impact that that person has had on our lives. So we remember. Secondly, I say we are here to rejoice. And especially if it's a Christian funeral, we have a lot to rejoice of. I think one of the unique things about a Christian funeral is that we sing. And we sing with hope. And so we are going to rejoice because we know that because of Christ, to be absent in the body is to be present with the Lord. So we want to rejoice. But the third thing we're here to do is to reflect. To reflect. And I often say, a lot of times funerals weren't on the calendar the week before, right? This wasn't on your radar a week before in a lot of situations. And I say to them, I don't believe you're here by accident. And this is an opportunity for you to reflect. And I go to this passage in Ecclesiastes where Ecclesiastes says it's actually better for you to be at a funeral than at a party. Now, I wonder at times what people are thinking when they hear that from me. Perhaps it's as jarring as it may seem when we read the comparison we find in verse 1. I get that it's better to be a beautiful person than to smell beautiful, but how can it be better for me to be at a funeral than at a party? And how does the word sit with those closest to the person who they come to grieve and to mourn? And yet this is the advice we're given by Kohelet as he takes in this vain life. Now, he's not suggesting that death is good and life is bad, nor is he calling for a ban on birthday parties. Several times when you go through the book of Ecclesiastes, the encouragement for man is to eat and to drink and to find enjoyment in the few days life God has given him. So God is pro-party. He's not anti-party here. Furthermore, death is not to be celebrated. It's our enemy. It's an evil. And yet, it's the way of all flesh. Don't forget what we saw at the beginning of the sermon. Whatever has come to be has already been named. Death is our predetermined lot in life. And so it's important that we keep our mortality in front of us. And this is what we find in verse 2. Why is it better to go to a funeral than to a party? Kohelet says, "For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart." So when I say to a group of people in front of me that you are here to reflect, what I'm really saying is someday there's going to be a group coming because you have passed on. In other words, it's wise to keep this reality of life in front of you. Philip of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great, he commissioned a servant to stand in his presence each day and say to him, "Philip, you will die." Does that sound morbid to you? Or does that help you think about how you spend the precious day in front of you? It's a gift. Contrast that to Francis Louis XIV, who decreed that the word death not be uttered in his presence. And yet, no amount of suppressing this truth will alter what God has ordained. Do you know what happened on September 1st, 1715? Louis XIV, guess what? He died. Someday we will die, and it's wisdom that takes this into account. In fact, it's the very truth that enables us to enjoy the days that God has given to us. After reading about the regiment Brian Johnson is maintaining in order to not die, it feels to me he's spending more time working on not dying than he's actually living. I feel like saying to him, eat a cookie every now and then. Now, I know some of us probably need to take the other advice, restrain yourself from a cookie every now and then, but eat a cookie every now and then. Enjoy life. Embracing the truth of my death actually enables me to truly live my day with joy and gratitude. That's the testimony of verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter. Why? He concludes, for by the sadness of face the heart is made glad. The brevity of life forces us to reckon with what truly is important. Now, when we put the lens of Jesus on top of this, how much more so is this true? While death is the way of all flesh, we now have the assurance through Jesus on the cross, his resurrection, his ascension, that death has been defeated. I saw a clip a couple years ago where Arnold Schwarzenegger was on the Stephen Colbert show, and Stephen Colbert goes through these series of questions that he asks him, and Stephen Colbert will always include in his questions, he'll always include, what do you think is going to happen to you after you die? He hits him with a bunch of what's your favorite movie, or what's your favorite this and that, and then right in the middle he says, what do you think is going to happen to you after you die? And Arnold Schwarzenegger said, why do you think I keep pumping iron? When death comes knocking on my door, I will terminate him. And everybody laughs because they're like, you're just, it's not true. Contrast that to the lead singer for U2, Bono. He was on a spiritual pilgrimage to the Holy Land, standing at the spot where many believed Jesus was crucified on the cross. He said with a sense of wonder, wow, this is the place where death died. It's one of my favorite lines in songs that we sing. Death has died. What was once my foe has actually now become my friend. How so? To be absent in the body is to what? Be present with the Lord. What was once terminal is now transitional. As Tim Keller said on his deathbed, I'm ready to see Jesus. See, this gives a whole new perspective on how we receive the wisdom of Ecclesiastes 7, 1-6. We don't just think of our pending and sure death as a way to make the most of our day. It's far more hopeful than that. In the preface of his book, Be Thou My Vision, Jonathan Gibson writes about his friend Sam Chapman. And Sam was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia in his late teenage years. He struggled with his illness for over a decade before passing away at the age of 30. He said Sam lived for 2 days, today and that day. But when we talk about that day, we're not just talking about taking into account the day we die. Rather, we're talking about the day when we hear the voice of Jesus calling us home. How much more should we be drawn to the house of mourning? How much more should that day be a source of strength and joy for today? For me to live as Christ and to die is gain. It's better to die well. Now, this brings us to the second set of Proverbs, and on the surface, they seem more disconnected than the Proverbs we find in verses 1-6. And when you first read through them, they feel like a rapid and random pieces of advice. Like when I first read through them, I felt like I was sitting around a table at a Chinese restaurant, and we were just reading our fortune cookies to each other, and one didn't have anything to do with the other. For example, look at the string of Proverbs strung in verses 7-10. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. And so you say, well, what do these proverbs, these pithy statements, have to do with one another? What are they telling us? Is there any glue that holds them together? Jacob Gerber thinks so, and he says that these statements are telling us how to live well. So, first point, it's better to learn how to die well. The second point is it's better to learn how to live well. The glue that holds these statements together is the reminder that we shouldn't be surprised when we encounter difficulty or challenges. Consequently, he said we should be measured in how we react to these things. So when you see oppression, don't be surprised by it, and don't let it drive you to madness. We need to learn to be patient. Don't let anger fester in your heart. Don't get caught up in the sense of nostalgia that has you pining for the past, the good old days, causing you to miss out on what God has for you in the present. We're not just reminded that life is short. So often we allow these things to encounter that we encounter in life to consume us, and he's telling us how to live well while we live the few days of our vain life in which we pass like a shadow. So let me just kind of pick one of these out, and let me kind of illustrate what I mean by this. So verse 8, it says this: better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. So what is he saying here? When you start out on a venture, you are often filled with a sense of excitement, and you are filled with a measure of optimism. You're thinking, this is going to be great. Think of a couple standing there on their wedding day, imagining how great life is going to be together. Like this wedding day, our whole life is going to be like our wedding day. Think of the college student entering their freshman year with the anticipation of a newfound freedom that comes with college life. And they're thinking like, this is going to be great at the beginning. And then the semester begins to unfold. Or think about the mother and father anticipating the birth of their first child and that romantic sense of having a baby, and they're looking forward to having a baby. And then that baby comes, right? It changes everything. There is no way to prepare a first-time mother and father for what is about to hit them. When I sit down with a couple in premarital counseling, I draw a big circle. I say, this is your life right now. And then I say, if you get married, I draw a smaller circle. And I say, this is your life when you get married. You have to think about somebody else besides yourself. And then I said, and then when you have a baby, I draw a dot. I said, you have no life. But you can't adequately prepare them for that. Our daughter had her first child a couple years ago, 2 years ago, and they had a hard first 3 months. And my wife went up there, and they looked like they were done, right? And they looked at each other, and they actually said, "And we asked for this? Like we wanted this?" And so the proverb here is saying, "Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit." I like the way Gerber addresses the blind optimism that we often start out with in our various ventures. He says, listen, slow your roll. And this is great advice. Don't have too high of expectations. This is a difficult, dark world. It's better for you to think about the end of things and to be patient with whatever comes. Many of you who now sit with several generations behind you, you know what that's like. You endured the raising of children. You endured the struggles of marriage. You endured all of that, and now you're sitting where you're sitting, and you're looking at the joys and the hardships and the sufferings, and you're saying, you know what, at the end of the day, it was worth it. And as that patience bears fruit, you can see how God has carried you through the journey of life. And so he's saying, listen, better is the end of a thing than its beginning. And when you put these two sections of Proverbs together, there's a common wisdom that tells us if we learn to die well by living with a sense of our mortality, then that helps us live well. This is especially true if you know you don't have long to live. When the columnist Irma Bombeck received her cancer diagnosis, she wrote a column reflecting on the brevity of her life and knowing what she knows now, if given a second chance at life, how she would live differently. And so she thought about all these different things that she would do differently. She said, I would have never bought anything just because it was practical, wouldn't show soil, or was guaranteed to last a lifetime. She said, I would laugh and cry more over life and less over TV. My kids, when they kissed me impetuously, I would never said, now go wash up for dinner. I would have listened more to my grandfather ramble about his stories and his life. She said, I would have not complained about 9 months of pregnancy. I would have realized that this is the only chance I have to partner with God in a miracle. And then she said, I would say, I'm sorry more. I would say, I love you more. And then she said this. She said, listen to this. But mostly given another shot at life, I would seize every minute, look at it and really see it, live it and never give it back. And then with all caps, she writes, stop sweating the small stuff. Don't worry about who doesn't like you, who has more than you, who's doing what. Instead, cherish the relationships we have with those who love us. I think that's very similar to the conventional wisdom of our passage. If you live with a sense of your mortality, then you're better equipped to react well when life flies at you. And yet, the things of these proverbs, dishonesty, impatience, anger, discontentment, are not simply overcome, and Charles was talking about this morning, by sheer will. In fact, I would suggest that if given another shot to life, you'll find yourself struggling with the same things that ensnared you the first time around. As much as you would like to say, I can change it or want to change it. Same temptations, same complications in relationships we all navigate. This too requires us to look at these things through the lens of Jesus. Like we were talking about this morning, Charles was talking about. regular confession of sin, rehearsing in our hearts, in our minds, how Jesus considered others better than himself and humbled himself. When we're tempted to be impatient or to be angry or to fill with discontentment, it's the regular means of grace. It's gathering worship. It's being in the Word. It's being in fellowship with one another that God uses to shape that in us. And so as we abide in Christ, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, is formed within us, and we are able to live well. Now, finally, I just want to introduce this last point. It'll lead into our look at tomorrow morning. Verses 13 and 14. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Both of these commands are calling us to consider God and his ways. Consider the work of God in the day of prosperity and in the day of adversity. Consider God has made one as well as the other. This leads us right into what we're going to look at tomorrow morning. We're being called to trust God in the few days we have in this vain life. It's better to die well. It's better to live well. It's better to trust well. Who can make straight what he, God, has made crooked? The word crooked here is not referring to something of an issue of morality, what is good versus what is bad, like that crooked. It's not what he's talking about. Rather, what is crooked refers to the things God has allowed in our lives that perhaps we wish we could change. What is the thing in your life you would change if you had the power to change it? Here's something I know for sure. Everyone's lot in life has some crook in it. What God has allowed in your life, Ecclesiastes tells you, you do not have the power to change. Look what he says next for us to consider. Both the day of prosperity and the day of adversity, he says, God has made one as well as the other. And then he says, so that man may not find anything that will be after him. In other words, you don't know if tomorrow will be a day of prosperity or a day of adversity, but what you do know for certain is that God is there and you can trust him. And when you lay the lens of Jesus over this, we know that our days of adversity are there to cause us to find our hope in him. I assume some of you, like me, have been caught up with the testimony of Ben Sasse, former senator of Nebraska. Anyone familiar with what I'm talking about? Was diagnosed with a very aggressive pancreatic cancer. Strong Christian. He was given a few months to live back in December, but he's on this experimental drug. Actually, was on. I saw another article today about it. He's on this experimental drug that's extending life for him a little bit. It's a very has a lot of side effects, but nonetheless, and so he's been on a lot of interviews talking about his cancer. It metastasized to the point where he has 5 cancers in his body. Recently interviewed by Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes, Ben Sasse, Strong Christian Faith. When Pelley asked him if he prays for a miracle, Sasse said, sure. He said, but it's not my biggest prayer because mortality is not news. We're all mortal. We're all on the clock. We're all going to be pushing up daisies, he said. I think wisdom requires us to grapple with our death and our finitude early. And while he gave voice to hating cancer and hating death, he spoke of the blessings there is in knowing that where he is on the clock and how it forces him to focus on what's important in life. And he said that the lie I want to tell myself is that I am at the center of everything and I'm going to be around forever and I can work harder and I can store up enough to atone for my own brokenness. He said, I hate cancer, but I'm also grateful for it. In an emotional part of the interview, Pelley wondered how Sass is dealing with the idea of not being around for his family. He spoke about being bummed out about not being able to walk his daughters down the aisle and to guide his teenage son through life. And he said, you know what? This is not a surprise to God. And Pelley asked, and you believe God has a plan? And with a smile on his face, he said, absolutely. And I love this statement. He says, there are no maverick molecules in the universe. And that brings us back to the beginning of the passage. Whatever has come to be has already been named. Consider God in the day of prosperity. Consider God in the day of adversity. And it is better to trust well. So as we ponder our days of our vain life, our few days of our vain life, what good is there for us to embrace so that we might live this week well? It's better to die well. It's better to die well. My wife came home one day and said to me, how many Wednesdays do you think you have in a lifetime? Now, I'm not a math guy, so for me to even begin to try to figure that out, she said, if you live to 80 years of age, you have 4,000 Wednesdays in a lifetime. That's not a lot. Now figure out where you are in range of 80. Some of you owe some Wednesdays, right? Beyond 80, right? Right? I'm well into 3,000. Doesn't that make each day special? Like how many times are you looking forward to Wednesday to get over hump day so that I can get on to the weekend? Like I don't want to enjoy my Wednesday, right? But death is a way, thinking about our death is a way that we're able to live each day with purpose and meaning. It's better to live well, abide with Jesus so that when life comes at you, you'll react with honesty and patience and grace and contentment, the fruit of the Spirit. It's better to trust well. In prosperity and adversity, God is at work, so trust Him. Let's pray. Father, I thank you that as we look at these challenging thoughts in Ecclesiastes, real issues of life and death, I thank you that we can do so with hope. I thank you that we can look at these things from the perspective of above the sun, not just below the sun. And I thank you, Lord, for that. I pray that you would help us to live our days with purpose and with joy, receive them as a gift, and Lord, that you would use us to be your presence wherever you take us. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you.
You are dismissed.